Welcome everybody. I'm very excited to kick off this webinar on constitutional performance assessment in the time of the pandemic. I would like to welcome you on behalf briefly of International IDEA, though you'll have a more formal welcoming from our side shortly. And also to thank our partners, CIDS and the University of the Philippines system at large, for what's been a really great collaboration. We're very excited to share the results of that with you today and look forward to your questions. Thank you also to all the participants who are joining. And with that, I think I will hand it over to Tessa to begin.
Thank you, Amanda. Distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends, good afternoon. On behalf of the University of the Philippines Center for Integrative and Development Studies, or UPCIDS, I wish to welcome you all to the webinar launch of the Constitutional Performance Assessment in the time of a pandemic, the 1987 Constitution and the Philippines COVID-19 response. I would like to congratulate International IDEA and the UPCIDS Program on Social and Political Change, or UPCIDS PSPC, for launching this webinar series. This event is part of the 2020 activities of the UPCIDS, which is the research policy unit of the UP system. Founded in 1985 by then UP President Edgardo Angara, the UPCIDS is currently under the Office of the Vice President for Academic Affairs. Since its inception, the UPCIDS has sought to encompass various perspectives, methodologies, and ideologies in its conduct of basic and policy-oriented research. Under the strategic trajectory of the university under the current UP administration, UPCIDS aims to contribute to national development and knowledge creation through enhancing research, publications, and creative work. Its channels to implement this vision includes lectures, forums, workshops, and roundtable discussions, and under the new normal, webinars. And this is actually the first webinar hosted by UPCIDS. So I'm sorry, the live streaming this all still have to be tweaked, but hopefully in the next seminar, this will all already be perfect. So as we have this afternoon. And we also have publications which include discussion papers, policy briefs, monographs in the Philippine Journal of Public Policy, Interdisciplinary Development Perspectives. These are all available at the UPCIDS website. To attain this, the UPCIDS has established 12 programs, which together with PSPC have all tweaked and or rehauled its project activities for the second half of 2020 to address crucial concerns brought about by the pandemic. The clusters on education and capacity building, which has the Education Research Program, the Higher Education Research and Policy Reform Program, the Assessment Curriculum Technology Research Program, are all undertaking activities to assist the Department of Education, as well as the Commission on Higher Education, or CHED, to address the challenges faced by online learning of students in the primary, secondary, and tertiary levels of education, among others. As for the Data Science for Public Policy Program, which is in this cluster, it was part of convening the University of the Philippines effort to push forward a One UP brand in response to COVID-19. It is also part of the university's Data and Information Management and Analytics Cluster DMAC project, which seeks to address looming socioeconomic issues of COVID-19 as well as its health aspects. For the cluster on development, we have the Escaping the Middle Income Trap, or Change for Change, which is the main coordinating body of the Philippine government's Interagency Task Force, or IATF, for COVID-19 in building a common resource data pool for addressing systemic problems, especially in times of a pandemic. As for the Political Economy Program, this is currently pursuing research needed by the following important sectors in a time of the COVID. These are namely the healthcare and pharmaceutical industries, agriculture, micro, small, and medium enterprises, among others. As for the Alternative Development Program, it is documenting the impact of the pandemic on its stakeholder communities in the Philippines and in Southeast Asia. And lastly, the Program on Health Systems Development is using their field sites to model pandemic responses of the rural health units. They have, for example, developed telemedicine portals in the province, in the regions of areas of Samal and Bulusan for this purpose. As for the third cluster on the social sciences, we have the Islamic Studies Program, which recently held a webinar on the ethics and modalities to follow with regards to Islamic burials in a time of pandemic. Another is the Strategic Studies Program, which is looking into the impact of the pandemic on Philippine foreign relations. A third program in this cluster is the Decolonial Studies Program, which is exploring possible themes in conducting decolonial ethical research studies that may help understand the impact of COVID-19 in Philippine society. And of course, but not least, we have the Program on Social Political Change, which seeks to examine governance responses to COVID-19. It is thus timely and crucial that International IDEA asked the program to collaborate on a study to assess how the pandemic has affected the performance of the country's 1987 Constitution and to also identify areas and trends to watch out for as the Philippine government responds to COVID-19. Given the pertinence of this topic and with the expertise of our panelists, I have no doubt that we will have a fruitful, engaging dialogue this afternoon that will lead to relevant policy outputs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate this collaboration as well, and that was a great overview of your programming. With that, I would like to turn it over to Lina Rakila Tamang to give some welcoming remarks on behalf of International IDEA.
Thank you, Amanda, and very good day to everyone. And on behalf of the International IDEA, I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar on the Philippines Constitution and how it is faring in a time of pandemic. I'm joining you all from Canberra, Australia, and hence I would like to acknowledge the Nunavalla people, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Many of you are keen followers of the Philippine politics and know that many of the institutions, including the House of Representatives, are keen on continuing the charter change discussions while the country is mitigating the effects of COVID-19. So what changes does the 1987 Constitution actually need, and how has the pandemic exacerbated key constitutional issues? Those and many others are the questions that we are to discuss in this webinar. Earlier this year, another paper, the Constitutional Performance Assessment of the 1987 Philippine Constitution, was launched. And that assessment concluded that most of the technical requirements of the Constitution have been met, but that not enough has been done in implementing many aspects, including democratization, decentralization, human rights, gender equality, economic development, to name a few. Now, the UP, University of the Philippines research team looked back on these findings and assessed how the pandemic has affected the performance of the Constitution and identified some worrying trends and warning signs for the pandemic response. Issues to watch out for are also detected by International IDEA's COVID-19 Global Monitor on Democracy and Human Rights, co-funded by the EU, pointing out to the sweeping powers provided to the executive to tackle the pandemic and the use of those powers to crack down on media. And we can detect weaknesses in separation of powers and some propensity to militarization. And we worry that these developments may further aggravate the democratic backsliding process the country has experienced since 2015. I would like to invite you to study the Global Monitor, which can be found from International IDEA website and which is monitoring COVID-19 from democracy point of view in 162 countries. We do appreciate comments and feedback on this global monitoring tool. Let me take this opportunity to thank UP research team led by Professor Maria Ela Atienza, has done a remarkable job with this paper. I also want to thank CIDS, the Center for Integrative and Development Studies, UP, for the wonderful collaboration and also for organizing this webinar today. And also thanks to IDEA colleagues involved in publishing this paper. The paper is available both from the International IDEA and the UP websites. The question of constitutional change is likely to continue after pandemic. Hence, this need for continued research, discussion, and debate on these issues. And that's what we are going to do today as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lena, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're very honored by your presence and appreciate your time. With that, I would like to turn it over to Maria Ela Atienza, who will give an overview of the previous performance assessment, the methodology that was used to complete that original paper that Lena referenced, and also an overview of how that criteria and methodology was applied to assessing the pandemic response in the Philippines so far.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. Okay, what I'll try to do is to briefly summarize the International IDEA methodology, and I have prepared some slides that the CIDS staff will be showing in a while, but the International IDEA's constitutional performance assessment methodology has been used for the first time in studying the South African case, and through a partnership with the UP CIDS and the UP Department of Political Science, we have embarked on studying the constitutional performance assessment of the 1987 Constitution. Next slide, please. Okay, so under the partnership with International IDEA, for this year, we were able to publish what Lena mentioned earlier in February during the anniversary of the signing or ratification of the people of the 1987 Constitution. We published the constitutional performance assessment of the 1987 Constitution, summary of findings, and we also followed it up because we feel it's important to continue studying the performance of the 1987 Philippine Constitution with our recently published discussion paper entitled Constitutional Performance Assessment in the Time of a Pandemic, the 1987 Constitution and the Philippines COVID-19 Response. Next slide, please. In looking at the constitutional performance assessment, the methodology of International IDEA uses a multi-pronged approach. It allows a more nuanced analysis of whether shortcomings in constitutional performance are actually a result of poor substance, meaning there's something wrong in some provisions of the Constitution, or actually the problem is in the area of poor implementation. Next slide, please. So, in looking at the constitutional performance methodology, we look at internal criteria and external criteria. In internal criteria, we identified with the Constitution's self-defined goals. Usually, this can be found in the preamble of the Constitution and, of course, in the Declaration of State Policies and programs. We assess the internal criteria by looking at what the constitutional provisions say about different institutions designed to meet this criteria. Compliance with the internal criteria is assessed by looking at whether or not the technical requirements in the Constitution have been met. Next slide, please. And then we look at external criteria. It's an assessment of the Constitution's design using normative criteria on what a Constitution should be and do in accordance with global practice and theory. In trying to find what would be external criteria that can be used in the case of the 1987 Philippine Constitution, we were helped by our advisory team of scholars and practitioners in constitutional performance assessment, and we selected 5 external criteria. Number 1 is democratization. Number 2 is decentralization. Number 3 is social justice, human rights, and gender equality. Number 4, peace and conflict resolution. And number 5, economic development. Next slide, please. So how do we know if there is compliance in the internal and external criteria? We use two types of compliance, thin compliance and thick compliance. In terms of thin compliance, this can be observed through fairly straightforward evidence as to whether institutions were set up, appointments were made, and laws adopted in a timely manner. So it's a fairly straightforward assessment. But when we talk about thick compliance, it means meeting the substantive goals set out in the Constitution and other normative goals used to assess the Constitution. For instance, how are they actually in practice? Eventually, there will be some, as we can see, some elements of thin compliance or thick compliance in certain areas. Next slide, please. After identifying the internal and external criteria, and you can check the more extensive questions that we have per criteria, we selected certain constitutional design areas. These are similar with the constitutional design areas identified by also in the South African case, in the study of the South African Constitution. So we were able to identify 9 constitutional design areas, and we will be presenting this this afternoon: electoral institutions, legislative executive relations, the judiciary, accountability institutions, local governments, rights, security sector, economy and labor, and finally, citizenship and equality. Thank you very much.
With that, I think I want to thank everybody again for joining us. I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself at the beginning, but I wanted to get through all these excellent speakers before weighing in myself. I'm Amanda Katzborough, and I work for International IDEA as a constitution building advisor for Asia and the Pacific out of the regional office. And part of our work in that stream is to support ongoing constitution building processes, which we define very broadly to include also debates and discussions about whether constitutional reform is needed, and not only the formal process of actually writing a new constitutional text. And in that way, we've been watching the Philippines for quite a long time and hoping to figure out ways of tracking and providing maybe an evidence-based format for discussing whether or not constitutional change is necessary and whether it would be impactful to address some of the challenges that the Philippines has faced under the 1987 Constitution. So that's sort of the premise for our support and collaboration with UP in this project. It's been a long collaboration and one that we're very grateful for. And it was happenstance that a lot of the findings ended up lining up quite, I don't want to say nicely, but relevantly with the pandemic response. And so we thought that it would be great to get out some more current analysis that really applied the findings that we'd already done a lot of research to identify to the pandemic response, and also then to the questions of whether constitutional change is still required in the Philippines. With that, I don't want to take up too much time. The format, as Ella mentioned at the end of her remarks, we will go through those 9 constitutional design areas. Some of the speakers on the panel will address 2 of the areas. Some of them will address 1, but we will cover all 9 through the panelists. I'll introduce the panelists in a moment. Each person will address 4 questions in discussing their constitutional design area. The first question is to highlight at least 1 trend or finding from the original performance assessment that was relevant to analyzing the current response to the pandemic in the Philippines. The second question is, within the relevant design area being discussed, how has constitutional performance been impacted by the pandemic? And will reflect both on challenges, how the Constitution has been challenged by the stress of the pandemic, but also how the pandemic response has made space for innovations and new practices which might inspire actually better constitutional performance in the long run. The third area or question that we'll look at is, as Lana mentioned with our International IDEA's COVID monitor, we're trying to highlight especially very key areas of concern in different countries. What are the really worrying signals that require a lot of attention from all of us in our different ways of working on these issues. So I'll ask the speakers to identify their one key thing to watch for, if there is one, in their constitutional design area. And finally, each speaker will close with some remarks about recommendations for the future, how to maintain constitutional performance or hopefully improve it, whether that would require constitutional change in terms of the text or just more innovation in sub-constitutional practices, as we will discuss in the next section. So with that, I will turn to the introductions of the panelists. We'll start with Ella Atienza, who needs no introduction. She's already spoken as a professor of political science and former chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of the Philippines. She is also a co-convener of the Program on Social and Political Change of the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies, UP CIDS, which is our partner for this particular initiative. Ella teaches graduate and undergraduate courses on qualitative research methods, political science research, comparative politics, and local politics. And she received her PhD in political science in 2003 from Kobe University in Japan. Ella will cover the sections of the judiciary and elections as constitutional design areas. We also are pleased to have Aris Aruga join us, as he's a professor of political science at the Department of Political Science of UP Diliman as well, and is co-convener of the UP CIDS Strategic Studies Program. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on comparative politics, international relations, research methodology, and political thought. He earned his PhD in political science in 2014 from Georgia State University in the United States. He will cover the area of the security sector. Next, we have Jean Encinas Franco. Jean is Associate Professor of Political Science at the Department of Political Science of UP Diliman. Before entering the academe, she worked for 15 years at the Senate of the Philippines, where she was the third director of the Senate Economic Planning Office, who we've also been privileged to do work with as International IDEA over the years. In 2011, Jean finished her PhD in political science at UP Diliman, and she will cover the areas of human rights and executive legislative relations. Next, we have Robert Go, who is Assistant Professor of Political Theory at the Department of Political Science of UP Diliman. He's currently pursuing his doctoral studies in political theory at the Central China Normal University in Wuhan, China, so has a whole other perspective as well on the pandemic to add to this conversation, which we're all eager to hear. Robert will cover the areas of local government and citizenship and equality. And last but definitely not least, we have Alicor Panejo, Associate Professor of Political Science at the Department of Political Science at UP. His research interests are in legislative politics, labor economics, and political economy. And he earned his PhD in political science in 2013 at the International Christian University in Tokyo, Japan. Alicor is joining us from Taiwan today, so we appreciate very much his time as well. And we'll cover the areas of accountability institutions and labor and the economy. So thank you very much for your time and attention through this brief overview. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ella, who will start, and we will then move through all the panelists. It will be quite a lot of information at one time, so we do encourage, if you have a copy of the paper, it might help to have it near you as we go through this. And then, of course, we will have the Q&A following the panel discussion for 30 minutes. With that, I'll turn it over to Ella. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.
Okay, thank you once again, Amanda. So let me discuss first the judiciary. In our first publication last February, we pointed out in the Constitutional Performance Assessment that the 1987 Constitution gave a lot of powers to the judiciary, particularly the Supreme Court, with the goal of making it more independent vis-a-vis the two other branches of government. However, we found out that the performance of its functions is actually constrained by pressures from the two other branches of government, as well as by limits in its resources. Also, it is lacking in efficiency and accessibility to all citizens, regardless of social stature, which constrains its performance in the areas of democratization and social justice. So, with COVID-19, it further complicated the judiciary's existing challenges. Though some positive developments can be opportunities for institutionalizing innovative reforms in the future. So how has the performance in these two areas towards goals been impacted by the pandemic? First, in terms of the operations and efficiency of the judiciary, when strict lockdowns were announced in March, legal proceedings and movement of people were immediately affected. So courts were closed, there were worsening existing backlogs, there were reported infections of COVID-19 of persons deprived of liberty. But there were some positive immediate actions on the part of the Supreme Court. First, the Supreme Court acted decisively by partnering with a software company to improve the efficiency and productivity of legal proceedings through video conferencing hearings in Metro Manila and selected cities nationwide. This is an important innovation because it contributes to the broader goals of access to justice and rule of law promoted by the 1987 Constitution, and thereby improving constitutional performance, even in the period of a pandemic. In the area of human rights, in order to decongest jails and limit the spread of COVID-19, the Supreme Court revised procedures to release inmates, particularly low-level offenders and sick and elderly prisoners at the earliest possible time. The revised procedure, as well as the institution of video conferencing hearings, expedited the release of more than 22,500 persons deprived of liberty as of May 2020. The Supreme Court also allowed the e-filing of complaints, petition for bail, submission of requirements for bail, and recently e-notarization to minimize physical contact in judicial proceedings during lockdown period. The pandemic has also put additional stresses on the Philippine judicial system, as we will see also in the other constitutional design areas, as new cases particularly related with how the government has implemented the lockdown and anti-COVID responses, how cases have been filed, and they add further to the issues that need to be resolved by the courts, especially the Supreme Court. Additionally, the Supreme Court is inundated by, as of today, maybe 23 petitions relating with the constitutionality of the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020. As former Supreme Court Chief Justice Artemio Panganiban wrote in his column in The Inquirer, the fact that various sectors brought their petitions to the court is proof that there is actually public trust in the institution. However, he also said that it behooves the court to exert every effort to be worthy of the trust reposed by the parties on their merits. So what are the key areas to watch out for, and what suggestions can we give for the future? And maybe at this point also to add the fourth question, what are the possible, do we need constitutional or other reform areas? So in terms of key areas to watch out for this, number one, for these innovations to further benefit all stakeholders in all regions of the country beyond the pandemic, there should be sufficient budget for all courts in the country to develop the technical infrastructure, train personnel and other stakeholders, and make mechanisms more accessible for indigents and persons with disabilities. These are issues that we have already identified in the findings in the performance assessment. There should also be faster processing of appointing judges in different parts of the country. While the digital innovations are definitely important to continue with court procedures beyond the pandemic, access to justice is still an important challenge for the judiciary, and alternative mechanisms for greater access by all sectors of society are actually needed. Another important area to watch out for is how the Supreme Court will respond to many of these petitions. How will this affect people's perceptions and trust in the independence of the judiciary, particularly the Supreme Court? Can it prove itself as an independent branch of government that can side with the Constitution and the interests of vulnerable people as it had in previous landmarks? cases. Now, let me go to the electoral institutions. Actually, the original writer of the electoral institutions is another colleague in the Department of Political Science, Assistant Professor Francis Joseph B., who cannot join us for this phase on COVID, the risk constitutional performance assessment in the time of COVID due to certain administrative duties. And some inputs in the electoral institutions have been provided by Associate Professor Alicor Panao. So based on our assessment, there is thin compliance with the Constitution's mandate for free, fair, and regular elections, and generally peaceful transfer of power that promote democratization in general. The assessment also points to the continuing challenge of inclusivity of electoral processes for all qualified Filipinos, particularly for persons with disabilities, senior citizens, and PWDs in order to achieve the broader goals of democratization and social justice. How has COVID impacted on electoral institutions? COVID-19 led to the postponement of a plebiscite in the province of Palawan that will decide on the ratification of a law that seeks to divide the province into 3 provinces. Furthermore, registration for new voters nationwide in preparation for the 2022 elections has been suspended several times already this year due to COVID, and to allow the COMELEC or the Commission on Elections time to put in place preventive and protective measures against COVID-19. The challenge for COMELEC or the Commission on Elections and Congress now is how to be able to conduct and improve the voter registration process and prepare for the 2022 elections to make the processes more efficient and inclusive despite the new precautions required due to the pandemic. The COMELEC has taken a number of steps. Last May, it has approved a test run for a mobile voting application catering to overseas Filipino voters. It is also in the process of contemplating the prospect of allowing the marginalized, such as persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, elderly and pregnant women to cast their votes ahead of other voters and exploring such mechanisms as voting by mail. There's also a Senate bill that was filed allowing voter registration through the development of an automated online system which would ensure social distancing and minimizing the risk of contracting the disease. What are the key areas to watch out for and what suggestions can be given for the future? It's important that at this point we have to watch out for ensuring that the plebiscite on the Palawan's division can be done without compromising people's health because it will be a test case for the general elections in 2022. We also have to ensure the voters' registration for the 2022 elections can be done without compromising people's health. It's also important at this point to watch out the preparations for the 2022 elections. It's important that elections will continue with possible innovations and reforms to balance the achievement of free, fair, and regular elections and generally peaceful transfer of power with health protocols. And finally, we have to make sure that Congress will support new procedures and laws to address the inclusivity and free, fair, and regular elections, even in a period of a pandemic, as well as allot sufficient budget for these reforms, even given the general budget constraints at this point due to the pandemic. And perhaps this is a running issue across all the other institutional design areas. It's also important to discuss possible constitutional reforms or reforms in laws related with electoral and party system reforms. And at this point also the possibility of direct democracy, as there are also petitions to try to use direct democracy to deal with the giving of franchise of ABS-CBN. So I will stop at this point. Thank you very much.
To do presentations on 2 constitutional areas, the economy and labor, and then accountability institutional. Let me just post my slide here. Okay. As we know, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic continues to devastate despite attempts towards extensive implementation of control measures As it unfolds, however, it becomes clear that there is more to it than a health crisis. The economic crisis unleashed by the outbreak of COVID-19 is hurting economies regardless of income level. Now, in the constitutional performance which we have undertaken, we observe that there is no dearth of policies allowing for equitable access to economic opportunities for sectors such as women, the elderly, single parents, persons with disabilities, and other marginalized sectors. Ideally, then, this should have insulated the country from socioeconomic impacts of the crisis. Now, unfortunately, we also found that the implementation often reduces constitutional and legislative policies into thin compliance. Now, that's a problem. One particular observation or finding that worries us is how, for example, COVID-19 has further exposed not only the vulnerability of certain sectors, but also how poor execution of otherwise well-intended laws have aggravated economic dislocations and inequities. Now, on a positive note, of course, we had, government passed RA 11469, which is the Bayanihan to Heal as One Act. It was a quick stimulus plan meant to minimize the impact of economic dislocations due to the pandemic. After the law was passed, executive agencies followed suit. Now, the Labor Department, for example, enjoined companies to allow workers flexible work arrangements during the pandemic. The Trade Department also granted a moratorium on commercial and residential rents in Metro Manila during the lockdown. State regulatory agencies, for their part, extended deadlines for filing reports, documents, and taxes. But the Bayanihan Act is not complete and seems to have overlooked certain sectors, even though the crisis affects everyone. Obviously, it does. The economic stimulus plan, Bayanihan Act, has been particularly criticized for leaving out those whose jobs have been directly affected by business suspensions, but whose income taxes directly support the stimulus. There were also irregularities in barangay level identification of beneficiaries, leaving millions of households, mostly from the vulnerable sectors, out of the recipient list. Poor screening has also emboldened some of those receiving aid from the system to abuse it. Reportedly, some beneficiaries use the money they got from government as capital to peddle illegal drugs or finance vices they could not afford. Also, the stimulus plan was silent on the plight of overseas Filipino workers, people whose remittances have become the Philippine economy's lifeblood. The Department of Labor estimates that about 40,000 to 50,000 OFWs, migrant workers from overseas, are expected to return home to the Philippines due to the widespread unemployment caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Also, while employees welcome the go signal for flexible work arrangements, it may be difficult in practice because of slow average fixed broadband speed, making work from home difficult, especially for employees in the business process outsourcing. These problems are not new. In the constitutional performance assessment, we know that investors have pointed out that poor telecommunication infrastructure is actually one of the major business obstacles we have in the Philippines, which discourages investment. Now, in all these, what do we need to watch out for? I think health and education are two areas that merit particular attention because they have long-term economic implications. Although evidence is yet to be fully established, there appears to be a relationship between a resilient national healthcare system and effective COVID response. In the Philippines, however, public health institutions have carried the burden of healthcare even before the pandemic. Given the country's socioeconomic profile, of course, COVID test kits would not be accessible for many. The state insurance system is not exactly among the most efficiently managed, as you know. Add a dole-out system to that, plus corruption. it will surely deplete the funds of the national health insurance system. COVID also has a massive effect on education as schools shut down in compliance with quarantine measures. Even though the education departments have guidelines for blended learning, this means a combination of physical and distance learning. In many areas, both teachers and students still lack the resources and infrastructure for distance learning. As we contemplate on possible policy reforms during and after the pandemic, I would like to focus on three: health, education, and infrastructure. As for education, it may be time to rethink our economic policy that puts too much premium on sending labor overseas. In our assessment, this will take 1 minute more probably. In our assessment, we found that one reason why agricultural policies fail is because people have long ago shifted their preoccupation from agriculture to migrant labor. As for health, there may be need to overhaul the national health insurance system. Currently, as you know, PhilHealth is on the spotlight for allegations of corruption after reports of overpriced procurement surface. We could take lessons from other countries. In Taiwan, where I am currently, they follow a single user system where everything is fully automated and reimbursement systems are practical. People can go to medical institutions freely and pay only a fixed amount of cost, and everything is shouldered by the government. This high accessibility and local payment conditions, encourage people to habitually visit clinics. Now, this is good as far as pandemics are concerned because during times of epidemic, the medical profession can easily track potential patients. Finally, there may be need to work out on our infrastructure, of course. In our assessment report, we found poor infrastructure, again, worries investors. If you can read the rest of my recommendations here, but two important things I need to point out, though, are provisions on the short term. One is there may be a need for a law providing for capital support to small entrepreneurs instead of taxing them, as well as providing tax break for companies who will not lay off or downsize during the pandemic. I will proceed directly now to accountability institutions, if you don't mind. Independent constitutional bodies, by that I mean the Commission on Audit, the Civil Service Commission, and the Commission on Elections, are provided in the Constitution primarily to safeguard the democratic institutions. But they are there as well also to ensure that government can be held accountable to the citizens and the constitutional process as part of the broader goal of independent and expert oversight of different government functions. Now, in our assessment, we found that while these bodies provide important additional checks on major institutions of power, institutional incapacity can hamper their efforts. Like courts and prosecutorial agencies, there is lack of material and human resources. We also observe that there is a deficit in laws that protect auditors and inspectors from threats or injury in the exercise of their functions. There is also dearth in policies that facilitate accountability oversight, poor e-governance infrastructure, difficulty in accessing public records, etc. On top of that, other agencies themselves are threatening the independence of accountability bodies. When Metro Manila was placed in a lockdown last March, operations in government also halted. Most of these government agencies are headquartered in Metro Manila, by the way. Now, on a positive note, COA and CSCs, the Civil Service Commission, allowed a number of alternative work arrangements for the government sector while the country is in a state of public health emergency. These arrangements also ensured staffing for accountability institutions, which monitor government operation and the proper delivery of public funds and public services. In addition, COA, as the watchdog of public funds, has relaxed audit compliance under the government procurement law and allowed negotiated procurement of goods related to the COVID-19. Despite all these, however, flexible arrangements, etc., there remains to be a lot of challenges for public sector workers. For example, the Philippines has yet to come up with a fully digitized e-government infrastructure. That means auditing most of the time still requires auditors to be physically present to assigned units. COA's oversight functions becomes all the more critical when the nature of disbursement does not follow regular government processes, such as, for example, appropriations and procurements made during the pandemic. It does not mean, though, that oversight functions have to stop. So we have a couple of recommendations. In fact, oversight functions become more crucial than ever at this point. As possible areas of reform, the government may want to consider policies that look forward to, let's say, full-scale digitization of government records, including financial reports by agencies. Now, not only will this be a major step in e-government effort, it will also ensure the performance of oversight functions even when quarantine measures are in place. But this implies also that we need to work on our e-governments, government and telecommunication infrastructure at both national and local levels. Now, it may also be time to pass a whistleblower protection law to assist in the prosecution of corrupt public officials. There are several laws currently filed in both House and the Senate to this effect. We may also consider a law that allows for occupational risk allowance for election inspectors and state auditors. Now, finally, we may also need to re-examine a practice sanctioned in our government auditing rules that require state auditors to hold physical offices within agencies that they are assigned to audit. According to a LEDEC report, this actually causes a number of issues. For example, assigned auditors easily get corrupted or bullied by agency heads and regular employees where they are assigned. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'll be talking about the local governments, and I'll be basically speaking in broad strokes because the idea of local governments, and their role here in this pandemic is very large, very huge, and we cannot cover every aspect of the role of the local governments. The initial assessment of this part of local governments were written by Professor Atienza and I, but the inputs for the assessment of the local governments for pandemic was primarily or mostly from Professor Atienza. So so while the Philippines is a unitary state, and we know that under the 1987 Constitution, we have a strengthened decentralization scheme through the local government code. And basically the idea is to have strong local governments, achieve decentralization, and optimize local autonomy. So giving more tasks and responsibilities, powers, and resources as well to local governments. But from the more than 30 years of experience under the local government code, we can see that the capacity of local governments is not even. Some local governments have better performance because they have more resources, others are not. And we see that reflected here during the pandemic. The national government has, in fact, deputized the local governments to deliver the services. And therefore, we can see that the role of the local governments are more of implementers in the context of the pandemic, and maybe even before. And this is just highlighted during this particular period. So genuine autonomy is restricted by the more top-down style of national government handling of the pandemic, which is in contrast to this very principle and goal enshrined by the Constitution. Given that local governments have taken the step, and this is now dependent on how the LGUs would actually work. If you have fast-thinking and innovative mayors, for example, not only within the National Capital Region, but also outside. We see that their proactive stance, have helped in trying to, not only in trying to mitigate the spread of the virus, but also in dealing with other issues, not exactly the issues on health, but also issues related to the lockdown, to the pandemic, like dislocation of constituencies, of the constituents, and perhaps livelihood, and these other aspects. And as mentioned, there are LGUs which are in good conditions, and these are working good for them, but others are not. Okay, and so we see the role of the coordination between the local government and the national agencies, and there are LGUs which have proved to have that kind of good coordination between their local government and the national agency. They have also worked with other groups, citizens, civil society groups, and I think this has improved the kind of handling of the pandemic because of the coordination of the LGU, not only with the national agency, but also with other stakeholders within the locality. And we also see that in LGUs and mayors, they have a lot of income. Some LGUs have larger incomes and resources compared to other LGUs. They have better or skilled local bureaucracy, good data management, and evidence-based decision making, and this have proved to be helpful for their local governments. However, as we have seen even prior to the pandemic, there are situations where these are not present, and local governments, particularly poorer municipalities, are challenged. How do we now meet the challenges of a pandemic when, even prior to the pandemic, they are not able to provide even the minimum? Okay. So what are the key areas to watch out for? And we know that the Duterte administration has initially championed the federalism, but we have seen that it has not been fully supportive of the development of local autonomy and devolution. And that's basically seen on how local governments now are treated as implementers. But we also see how regional development has taken a leading role in this case. For example, regions like the Bangsamoro region, they were able to organize themselves and come up with strategies and be able to address the challenges during this pandemic. So I guess there is a potential, after the pandemic, to give more roles for regional bodies or groupings of LGUs, in the future. And this pandemic response has demonstrated the need for a stronger role for LGUs and the regions, not only in terms of economic planning and implementation, but also localizing responses to crisis, because each locality would have different contexts, and it's better if we can have our measures address this context. Now, on the area of citizenship and equality, this is a rather abstract, and it's very hard to achieve, particularly the level of equality. It's a continuing goal, if you may. And in the earlier constitutional performance assessment, we see that provisions on social justice and human rights, trying to create a sense of social equality, is yet to be fully realized. While there may be laws passed by Congress, this, in terms of implementation, it was not fully implemented by the executive branch. And in the context of the pandemic, we see, and I think it's a natural challenge, because you have to impose lockdowns, restrictions, quarantines. So citizens' involvement has been limited. It was not maximized. Of course, the Constitution said that we must enjoin citizens to participate in policy making, decision making. But in this context, it seems that it's like there is difficulty on getting that kind of setup work. So people have resorted to alternatives such as the social media, for example, airing their sentiments through social media. But of course, this is not true for all cases, because in geographically isolated and disadvantaged areas, you don't have that particular kind of advantage. No. Of course, there are LGUs which try to be inclusive, but as I mentioned earlier in the local government section, the top-down orientation of decision-making is strengthened in the context of pandemic. And so you see that citizens are not very much involved there. Strategies have been devolved to LGUs too. And now the involvement of citizens varies depending on the locality and the openness of the local officials. And with strict quarantine in place for several weeks, and it has been, they have returned the ECQ, officials who are more open have taken advantage of the interactive nature of social media to gather inputs from citizens. So what are the key areas to watch out for in this sector? Of course, there is a natural consequence of deterioration of the quality of life. We've seen the economy on recession now, negative 16.5%. I saw in the news report earlier, and that will continue to affect the lives of the people. But of course, there are things that we can look at how probably we can address these kinds of situations in the future. For example, being in a public health emergency, maybe we can give more attention to access of health services, and in the future invest on health services, because the poor health public health system that we have today is a consequence of how we have ignored or not invested on it enough in the past. So these are the things that we can think of. Of course, the quality and the quantity of services received by citizens are impacted by the political dynamics. So making some areas better, some areas not so better. And therefore, for future reforms, maybe we can look at, it's hard to really say that we have to change this particular sections or provisions of the Constitution in response to the pandemic, because even before, it's already hard for the government to actually realize those provisions. So, and the pandemic may have stalled the developments that we already met with citizenship and equality. So I guess we must just improve the implementation in the future and take in consideration the experiences we've had for this crisis. That's all. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will present to you on legislative executive relations and human rights. Legislative executive relations in the Philippines is firmly established in the 1987 Constitution. Our initial performance assessment indicates that current political institutions and their unintended consequences, coupled with weak political parties and pork barrel dynamics, inhibit the establishment of a strong and independent legislature. The onset of public emergencies and crises such as COVID-19 bears this out. Notably, this is not the first time that the Philippine Congress granted the President emergency powers. After a 1989 coup attempt that damaged the economy, President Corazon Aquino was granted emergency powers by Congress. In the 1990s, then President Fidel Ramos was faced with a looming water crisis that may threaten his bid for rapid economic growth. Congress granted Ramos emergency powers to privatize water companies in the country and overhaul water governance and its regulatory mechanisms. During the pandemic, the trends identified in our initial performance assessment have only been further exacerbated, with greater consolidation of power in the executive branch and further weakening of the separation of powers, as Congress has not taken deliberate measures to exercise its oversight functions over the executive. More than a week after the declaration of public health emergency due to COVID, President Duterte asked Congress for emergency powers, citing the need, of course, to realign resources. The proposal was taken on by the House and came to be known as Bayanihan to Heal as One Act or Republic Act 11469. Citing public emergencies, the provision allows because this is what is in the Constitution, the provision allows the President to certify a bill as urgent due to public emergencies. Under this setup, Congress does away with certain crucial steps in the normal legislative process that ensure important aspects of democratic deliberation, such as the 3 separate days for 3 readings. However, in a report on emergency powers granted to Philippine presidents, argue that the slippery slope of frequent recourse to emergency rule is the ever-present possibility that such will slide into a permanent and unconstitutional regime. The swift approval of the law suggests that the heightened influence of the president vis-a-vis Congress in times of emergency. This is also helped by the support of blocs allied with Duterte in both houses of Congress. Prior to the onset of pandemic, Duterte remains very popular with more than 70% net satisfaction rating. In fact, there is a considerable body of literature indicating the positive relationship between popular presidents and congressional approval of his or her agenda. The Bayanihan Act gave Duterte 30 emergency powers, which, among others, provided a social amelioration program to Filipinos to cushion the impact of the pandemic. It provided hazard pay allowance to health workers or the so-called frontliners. As a measure of legislative oversight, Congress required the president to submit reports on the implementation of the law, which would have taken effect for only 3 months. As of June 2020, Duterte submitted his 14th report to Congress. Currently, however, there is little information as to the extent Congress has scrutinized these reports or how much deliberation has surrounded their submission. Ideally, Congress should examine these reports prior to the planned second version of the Bayanihan Act, which was expected after the legal lapse of the law on June 24, 2020. Critics still argue that emergency powers was unnecessary as the emergency could have been addressed without Congress delegating its powers to the executive. For instance, there is an argument that says that Congress must not easily surrender its power to legislate as well as its oversight and budget powers. It can provide flexibility to the president and enact supplementary budgets. In fact, there was someone who filed a petition before the Supreme Court to declare the Bayanihan Act unconstitutional based on undue delegation of legislative power to the president. However, the Supreme Court dismissed the petition on the ground that the respondents failed to show grave abuse of discretion. Aside from the grant of emergency powers to the president, the passage of the anti-terror law also gives you an indication of how much power the president has over Congress. Duterte certified the anti-terror bill as an urgent measure, as an amendment to the Human Security Act of 2007. Civil society groups expectedly protested the passage of the law and its alleged urgency in the midst of the country's fight against COVID-19. The House of Representatives approved the law, and by approving the Senate version without changes, the lower house avoided a BICAM conference committee, which could have delayed the law's final approval, as it would have allowed the opposition to ask open questions and thereby shape the language of the provisions. A deadlock would have stalled the measure's approval. The non-renewal of the ABS-CBN franchise is also another manifestation of the power or hold of the president over Congress. Overall, the above discussion shows that there is thin compliance in terms of enhancing the separation of powers of the legislative and executive branches. The government response to the pandemic is evidence of president's power over Congress and therefore the limited impact of constitutionally entrenched separation of powers in ensuring meaningful oversight or accountability of the executive branch. In fact, one key thing to watch out for is, for instance, the extent to which Congress will conduct oversight on the reports of the president or on the Bayanihan Act. As of now, there's already a citizen budget tracker, meaning to say societal accountability has come in. It is good because they're probably not trusting the extent to which Congress will conduct oversight on the Bayanihan law. Another key issue would be that the bicameral conference committee, and this is also something that we have found out in our initial assessment, is being done away in some legislative practices. It is a pity because it makes the legislative mill or the legislative process more opaque. The other issue that I'd like to talk about is on human rights. We all know that human rights is very much entrenched in the 1987 Constitution, mainly because the Constitution is a response to the violations made during the Marcos regime. In fact, the Constitution also includes a Bill of Rights in Article 3, Sections 1 to 22, which guarantees the right to life, liberty, property, speech, assembly, expression, information, travel, among others. With the onset of COVID-19, some of these rights have been further compromised, mainly due to the Duterte administration's militarist response to the pandemic. The Bayanihan Act gave Duterte $5.4 billion to address the pandemic, while it set the nation's direction in addressing the impact of the virus initially. Its implementation, as well as the ambiguity in its provisions, resulted in violations of civil liberties that have been enshrined in the Bill of Rights. There is also indication that Duterte is carrying over discourse from his war on drugs into this pandemic response. For instance, he controversially ordered citizens to shoot to kill if they catch others. He controversially ordered the military or the police to shoot to kill citizens who will violate quarantine restrictions. There were also counterinsurgency measures against the new People's Army despite ceasefire. This is worrying as such. Emboldened vigilante justice in the Philippines has led to murder rates with essentially no accountability for perpetrators. The rule by force style of governance represents potential human rights violations ranging in severity from due process to right to life against summary executions. The red tagging has also persisted even under the pandemic. Even reports of curfew violators being placed in dog cages, as well as the killing of an unarmed, mentally challenged individual in broad daylight. The approval of the anti-terror law is also seen by many as insensitive to the times. In fact, protesters critical of this proposed measure were also detained. What is also alarming is that images in media reports show that those who are likely to be arrested and detained are the poor and the disadvantaged. International IDEA's Global Monitor of COVID-19's impact on democracy and human rights cites freedom of expression as a fundamental human right to watch over during this period. However, the Bayanihan law has a provision allowing the government to interpret what it deemed to be misinformation. While the idea was to protect the public from supposed misinformation that can lead to more COVID-related deaths, the provision can of course have a chilling effect. Ensuring accountability in times of public emergency is very, very important. And when public officials need to act with urgency. Accountability is also important given that rights violations are committed in the name of quelling the pandemic. This is in fact reminiscent of the Philippines using emergencies as justification for curtailing essential rights. Another issue that the Philippines has to contend with was the um, non-renewal of the ABS-CBN franchise. And supporters mentioned that the reason why it was not renewed was because the network was very critical of Duterte, and that the television arm failed to air the campaign of then candidate Duterte in 2016. In fact, media attacks in the midst of the pandemic came into stark focus when Maria Ressa, a staunch media critic of Duterte, was convicted of libel in June 15, 2020. Lastly, the right to travel and decent work was also imperiled. Um, when the pandemic was already spreading in March and early April, the justification of public health and safety, through that justification, there will the right to travel of health workers and some workers for abroad was also curtailed. While this measure is necessary, this was the same provision that was used to issue a ban on overseas work for health workers in a resolution by the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration. The ban was meant to uh, foresee the shortage of health workers given the spread of the pandemic. It is unfortunate because travel bans for migrant workers usually result in migrant workers becoming undocumented in foreign uh, lands. When netizens and interest groups decried the ban, the administration backtracked but allowed only those with work contracts to leave for their work abroad. For local health workers, the initial total lockdown in March resulted in their lack of access to transportation. Private sector groups and the government or offered free rides to remedy the situation and quell negative public outcry. Some resorted to walking and using alternative modes of transportation. Overall, the 1987 Constitution established the institutional framework to allow human rights to flourish in the country post-Marcos. However, the performance assessment findings pointed to thin compliance with this constitutional goals since the Commission on Human Rights and other government agencies and policies were established. But in practice, rights are not realized all the time. The COVID-19 response and its militaristic implementation have highlighted the vulnerability of the rights compromised in the Constitution and the vulnerability of the rights in a country that has actually signed major international human rights convention. So, what are the key issues to watch out for in terms of human rights? I think it is important that we need to strengthen the culture of human rights in the country, and also that there is no doubt that COVID-19 is an emergency, but it is doubtful. It remains to be seen whether, at the end of the day, its purpose was served, and it remains to be seen whether Congress actually need not legislate an emergency powers law. Um, in cases when emergency powers need to be given to the president by Congress, I think it is important, it is imperative that built-in accountability mechanisms should be um, extended and strengthened, and also that the participation of um, civil society groups, particularly human rights groups, should be enhanced and ensured so that a rights-based emergency powers measure can be legislated. So that's it, and thank you.
Okay, last but not least is the security sector. Uh, Let me just emphasize first that in any democracy, the constitution is the anchor of society and the people. And despite the pressing need for security and the protection of the physical bodies of its own citizens, democracy and human rights should not be sacrificed. Uh, in the pandemic response of the Philippine government, of the Duterte administration, the security sector has been front and center, and therefore seems to be the most significant, if not one of the most significant institutions that are currently implementing policies related to addressing the pandemic. In our own assessment of the 1987 Constitution pre-COVID-19, we concluded that there is a robust constitutional framework for the democratic governance of the security sector. Responsibilities between security forces, such as the military and the police, are clearly delineated in the Charter. Moreover, there are also laws passed as well as policy documents, particularly the National Security Policy, that emphasize norms such as security sector reform, good governance, human rights, and respect for international law. The problem is that under the Duterte administration, this emerging thick compliance seemed to have been undermined by a critical informal institution. Political science debates have already argued that the formality of institutions need to be juxtaposed with prevailing informal norms and practices that may undermine the implementation of those formal institutions. In the paper that we wrote about constitutional performance, I proffered the existence of this informal norm, and that is the dominance of a political military network composed of retired military generals as well as civilian politicians who support them as dominating not only the security policy arena of the Duterte administration, but the administration itself. We clearly see this in the implementation of the protocols to address the pandemic. The interagency task force is led by retired military generals and their civilian political allies. With the poor quality of civilian oversight institutions, both in the executive, legislative, and other branches of government, this magnifies the impact of this informal institution in degrading as well as undermining norms such as civilian supremacy and democratic civilian control of the military and the security sector. One more important development is that because of the dominance of this political military network, there is a lack of appreciation of the complexity of the problem of the pandemic, as well as the seeming allergic reaction, if not acerbic reaction, to criticisms coming from different sectors of society. Where in the world do you see that citizens are blamed for violations stemming from the pandemic? Where do you see that medical professionals are seen as whiny people wanting to stage a revolution? What country do you see where tanks are being deployed in communities to implement pandemic quarantines? And where do you see that police don military colored uniforms instead of being the civilian political force that they are? As an observer of the security sector in the Philippines for almost 2 decades, I have seen how reforms in the security sector have been implemented by prior administrations. What are emphasized are norms of professionalism, as well as respect for human rights and international humanitarian law. The term security sector reform has appeared in the national security policy of the current administration. However, it is another matter whether this is being pursued with meaningful policies as well as impact by the Duterte administration. I have 1 minute. I just want to say that what are the areas to look for? The danger of inviting this political military network is that they will likely stay and that their impact is magnified by the network that they bring, composed also of both active and retired military. The opportunities for reform as well as constitutional overhaul seems to lie in emphasizing the importance of civilian oversight and addressing the blurring boundaries between what is civilian and what is military. For me, the greatest danger in the Philippines right now are not only militarized civilians, but also civilianized military people with the blurring of the boundaries of what is considered civil and military. That's all, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a great way to end. Certainly, last was not least. I think the security sector issue is incredibly important, and hopefully what we saw through all the panelists' discussion is how interrelated a lot of these categories are. So even though we are looking at these as constitutional design areas with a certain set of provisions and institutions, it's clear that the areas of human rights, the area of local government and citizenship and equality, all of these things are actually overlapping and interconnected. I have a lot of comments and questions myself, but given that we are a little bit behind schedule, I think we'll turn to some of the questions that we received from the participants. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. So if you are a participant and you would like to ask a question, please use that function to do so. The first question I think is meant for Ella, and it is about the devolution of health in the local government units as per the Local Government Code of 1991. Do you think our healthcare system can benefit from a unitary form of health agency, or does the devolved system serve us better? Should we amend the local government code, or do we amend the whole Constitution? That is one question. Should we take one at a time, given the format?
Maybe we collect and then a few, and then ask the resource persons to respond to them.
Okay, sure. Another question is, what is the suitable and best political system for the Philippines? Presidential system, parliamentary system, or semi-presidential system? And I think we're not in the business of prescribing which form of government is best, but maybe we can discuss in light of the findings and the suggestions about the relationship, especially legislative and executive relationship, what kind of form of government might help to address some of those issues. Another question is on how the policy directives, the government's policy directives in response to COVID are affecting children. Since the ECQ, there have been reports of violations committed by LEOs against the rights of children for violating ordinances on curfew, etc. How do you think the government can reconcile its response to COVID in ensuring that human and children rights are still protected? And maybe I'll ask one last question for now, and we can see if any others come in while you guys enter those. This one is for Jean. And it says, what would have been a better alternative to the supposed militarization as an approach to address the COVID-19 pandemic in the country? Certainly, obedience to government protocols would have been a major problem. So if you could address that. We'll start with those, and then if we have time, we can take a few more of the questions.
So maybe I'll start first, Amanda, with the question on the devolution of health services. Actually, even with the devolution of health services due to the local government code, we are still under a unitary system. Devolution is actually the most extreme form of decentralization that can happen under a unitary system. So we still have a unitary system, but certain services like health have been devolved. So I think indeed, the devolution of health services since 1991 have resulted in a lot of fragmentation of the healthcare system, problems in terms of meeting the goals or the national health goals, and of course, the access to health services of a lot of people. However, we have also seen a number of cases of good local government units with very good participatory programs in health. And through the years, there were laws passed by Congress to try to address the problems. Recently, of course, the universal healthcare system, which was supposed to address the fragmentation of the healthcare system. Although, of course, unfortunately, the first year of the implementation was is this year with the pandemic. But I think an important thing to focus on in the devolution of health services is to make sure that You still have a very important role placed on the Department of Health in monitoring the performance of health units, but of local government units. But at the same time, also there are laws that address the issues of healthcare workers, the issues, of course, right now we're talking about telehealth and possible restructuring as a result of the graft and corruption. What would be better, amendments in the Constitution or the local government code? Of course, there are things that need to be amended in the local government, in the Constitution related to local governance and health. But at this point, perhaps more immediate, we can address amendments in the local government code, particularly in earmarking particular budget for devolved services like health, and making sure that the allocation of revenue allotment will go to local governments with more responsibilities and more need to address the healthcare system. Thank you.
I answered. Do I respond to the question, or is there another one who needs to?
Yes, so I think that, Jean, if you can respond to the question about militarization, and I don't know if Aris also wants to weigh in there, given his focus on the security sector in his overview. And otherwise, perhaps I don't know who wants to take the question on form of government, but anyone on the panel can take that.
Yeah, just very quickly. Well, I guess the best way to have a non-militarized response is to also make the doctors not only the frontliners in the bid to cure the pandemic, but also in the IATF or in any task force that has been put up to fight COVID. It's unfortunate that the government has belatedly listened to a group of health workers who sort of responded to or criticized the way the responses is being implemented when over 100,000 COVID cases is already has already spread in the Philippines. Secondly, there has to be a broad-based consultation before the guidelines were issued. I know the government has to act fast, but then there are other factors that need to be considered to have a good response. They should have listened to the views of the transport sector, informal workers, and small scale businesses. And lastly, I think rather than punitive measures, I guess there has to be incentive-based measures so that people will also be encouraged to get involved, and also to not to violate quarantine sanctions or mask wearing.
Can I address the form of government question? Because this is a typical question asked in constitutional change debates. The consensus in comparative politics scholarship and literature is that grand institutional design, such as forms of government, are not really critical factors in arriving at outcomes such as efficiency as well as governability and representativeness. In fact, the devil is in the detail. So it really depends on the goals. If the goal is more governability vis-a-vis more representation, then certain tinkering of the current system might be able to address those patterns. So in other words, the saying is that it's not the car, it's the driver that matters. So we may have some spare parts that we can fix the old car, but at the end of the day, if the driver is behaving like this, then no new car or different car can solve the problem.
Thank you so much. I think there was one more question that I had mentioned about children's rights and the impact on children's rights. I don't know if anyone would like to address that. No? Anyone from the panel would like to address the question on children's rights?
Sino? Ako
Okay.
ba?
We can move on to the next if Jean, are you trying to answer the question on children? Can you mute if you're not speaking, please? Thank you. All right, well, there are a number of other interesting questions as well, but maybe we can move forward to a sort of general question about if there's a pressing need for constitutional change during the pandemic. What are the kind of immediate fixes that are needed? And what does this say about whether constitutional change is required writ large? It's a combination of a couple questions and open to anyone on the panel. Another question that I think is quite interesting is about the possibility of extending the transition period in Bangsamoro under the Constitution, given the pandemic and the impact that that might have had on the timeline. And there's another question about the Supreme Court ruling, the Mandanas ruling on the internal revenue allotment, and whether or not, what are the implications of this on decentralization and local governance for the country? Is this an area to watch out for from a reform standpoint? And I think the last question that I'll ask for today is also to combine there's a few questions about legislative and executive relations, and particularly about whether or not there's really effective oversight over the executive right now. One participant asked specifically about Senator Bowe's, I'm sorry, I lost the question now, participation in the task force, and whether or not that represents a conflict of interest or not. So I think I'll leave it for now with those questions, and again, they're not directed to any particular panelist, so whoever feels like they would like to answer, please feel free.
Amanda, can I answer the question regarding the Supreme Court decision regarding the allotment, the internal revenue allotment, the Mandanas doctrine? Yes, starting 2022, the allotment that will go to local government units will no longer just be based on the collections of the BIR, but also other types of income or revenues collected by the national government. The immediate impact of this, of course, is you have a bigger budget to be given to local government units, but of course, we heard a few weeks ago that the League of Municipalities would want this to be put in the Constitution. But I think another important aspect is, while local government units need more resources, the other important issue in the local government code is how the revenue shares are actually allocated to LGUs. For the longest time, there have been recommendations to make sure that the sharing to local government units will be based on need and performance. And I think even the Department of Interior and Local Government is pushing for that type of recalculating the formula of the sharing to local government. So I think it's important not just to provide more money to local government units, but you also have to make sure that the distribution is based on need, but there's also an emphasis on monitoring the performance of local government units. So you need a complete package to revise the local government code, and at the same time also to make sure that we address the other causes of problems in the performance of local government units. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you so much. Perhaps Robert, would you like to answer the question on the Bangsamoro transition period?
I'm not really very familiar with the Bangsamoro transition aspect, so I cannot answer that question. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, well, maybe does anyone on the panel want to answer that question? I can answer briefly otherwise, or if Ella would like to.
I'll address, yes, there might be some more time to consider, given that the implementation has happened during the pandemic. But we know that there is a timeline, and there might be certain legal implications if that timeline is not respected. I think that is the major challenge. Fortunately, or maybe unfortunately, the Philippines is not yet in an election cycle at the height of this pandemic, and therefore the impact of COVID-19 to elections and voting behavior, at least in the Philippines, has yet to be seen. But I do think this is where technology can come in, because this is something that needs to be seriously deliberated, because suspending certain democratic processes, particularly in a sensitive region such as BARM, may not bode well with the supposed pursuit of sustainable peace, something that the Duterte administration has promised.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much.
But Amanda, can I just address, because I think a lot of our attendees has this notion that if you change the institution, the behavior changes automatically. And therefore the logic is new institutions means a change in behavior. This is something that has bogged and really it's a problematic of political science for decades. But the consensus really is clear that institutions can only have limited impact. And there are two ways of addressing this. First is there are unintended consequences to institutional changes. If our attendees would like to remember, let's just look at the partyless system. The intentions of the partyless system were pure and democratic. It is to give representation to marginalized sectors. Look at how this law has been implemented and interpreted. So good intentions are not enough, because even the road to hell is paved with good intentions. We need to be smarter in tinkering with our institutions, and one of which is to be sensitive with how our current crop of politicians behave. If we don't have a consensus on their manner of behavior, then we are naively changing our institutions, hoping that they will change their behavior. That might be an impossible logic to follow.
Thank you so much. I think that's a very important point, and also part of the methodology of the constitutional performance assessment actually is to look at, are these things problems with the design of the Constitution and therefore the institutions themselves, or is this really a matter of institutional behaviors and other sorts of underlying maybe conditions, we can call it, that are impacting how the Constitution is functioning in society. So I think that's a very important point. I think there was one last question sort of generally dealing with oversight of the executive and the different ways that appointments and other processes within the pandemic response have suggested that there might not be robust separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches at this time. Who would like to take that question? I guess it, Alicor, do you?
I'll
Or
pass.
Jean? You pass? Okay, Jean, would you like to take that since you looked at the separation, that particular constitutional design area?
You mean the question on the separation of powers? Well, certainly this is what happened during this pandemic. It's just something that that's part of the continuity or the pattern in the post-EDSA Congress. The president has always been very powerful vis-a-vis Congress, especially in terms of in crisis situations. And what is there something asked on separate on appointments?
There were a number of questions related to that, so I was trying to combine them. I think the general question also is about the composition of the task force.
Yeah. I think yeah, I think it has something to do with Senator Bongo sitting in meetings of the IITF. Well, Senator Bongo is the chair of the Senate Committee on Health. I don't know if because of that position he earned his right to be in IITF, but it certainly confuses a lot of people. And I tell you, this has not happened before. And this is something that we need to to grapple with as Senator Go keeps on doing that, because it's certainly not very good in terms of optics. It affects us. It not only confuses people, but it certainly will leave them thinking that um, the executive and legislative branches are just one. Because at least in the past, there's pretension that there's separation of powers, but now parang there's no pretension anymore.
Okay, thank you so much. Ella, what do you think? We have some more questions, but we're also out of time. I don't know if you want to make any, should we take a couple more, or how do you want?
A couple more, yes.
Okay, I think there is, sorry, this is a bit, the format's a bit difficult. There's a question for you, Ella, on appointment procedures. Let me just find the exact wording of it. Do you see it yourself, or?
What is it about? It's
Sorry, I don't know. Some of these questions are like disappearing as I'm trying to find them. So we have, well, in the meanwhile, we have a question about the local government units and whether they've exceeded their powers with the ordinances that they've issued in relation to the pandemic, and also a question related to the financial empowerment of the LGUs, and how that's been impacted. So I don't know, perhaps somebody wants to answer that question on local government. And Ella, I'm trying to find. Oh, do you think that removing the power of the executive department in the appointment of Supreme Court justices will give more power to the latter, or at least relieve pressures from the executive?
Yeah.
And I think another really good question related to the earlier ones on local government is what can be done in the short term policy-wise to improve the services and capacities of the barangays to respond to the pandemic. So perhaps Robert can take the questions on local government, and Ella, if you would like to answer the questions on the judiciary.
Regarding the judiciary, the reason why we have the Judicial and Bar Council in the 1987 Constitution was the idea that precisely to remove from the legislature the power of appointment of members of the judiciary, because that was the problem before. And the idea in the Constitutional Commission in 1986 was they want a more independent judiciary. So politicians, like, although of course until now we have a member of the Justice Committee in the Judicial and Bar Council, at least that's the only legislative role given to appointment of members of the judiciary. However, of course, it's one important possibility is what we are seeing. It's because of the power of the executive to choose among the top 3 names given by the Judicial and Bar Council. So a president can really put people who can probably be more friendly to the executive. However, based on certain on the decisions of the Supreme Court, there are cases when even appointees of the president were actually voting not in favor of the position of the executive. So sometimes it really depends not so much on whether we remove the executive from the appointments or selection of members of the judiciary, but it also depends on because right now we have very weak monitoring of appointments. I think now there are efforts to make the appointment system and the nominees, the selection process more transparent. There should be more voice on the part of people and private sector in the process. And of course, a continuous monitoring or having very good watchdogs pointing to the performance of the judiciary in general.
Okay, so about the local governments, right? I'm not sure about what the person who asked the question about the abuses in the power of local governments when they make ordinances. Ordinance powers are within the powers of local governments, and maybe if the question would be more specific on which particular ordinance that was enacted or adopted by the local government, maybe we can see how there was an abuse, if any. Maybe people are talking about the liquor ban, and I think it is within within the power of the local government to impose such bans. Now, on the question of what we can do in the short term to further improve the services of the barangay with regard to the pandemic, it's easy to say that we provide more resources to them financially, but also we have to take into consideration the reality. Prior to the pandemic, not all barangays have barangay health centers, so that's already a challenge. And in the short term, maybe there can be makeshift barangay health centers. But again, the question of human resources, we do not have enough midwives, for example. Barangays heavily rely on barangay health workers, which do not have formal health professions training. So it's really a big, in the short term, there can be small patches of solutions, but these are band-aid solutions, if I may say. And given the decentralization and devolution of health in the Philippines, and barangays have the primary responsibility for the primary health care, it's going to be a system-wide, if we're going to think really of how to improve the services or capacitate barangays. It's a system-wide, because the local government unit where these barangays belong should have a more, let's say, give more importance or priority to health, so that these barangays, whether it is during pandemic or during regular times, they will be able to respond to health-related issues, at least at the primary health level. Because if it is secondary, it's already the responsibility of the LGU, and if tertiary, it's the national government already. So there can be small steps that can be taken. This is dependent on the resources available financially to these barangays, and I think the innovativeness, the creativity of the barangay captains and the community will come into place here. Yeah.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you for that very complete answer. I think that we will wrap up soon, but there's a couple questions that I think are sort of good to wrap up on, so maybe I'll pose them to the panel, and again, anyone who would like to respond. There's a general question about the economic impacts, obviously, of the pandemic response and how that is affecting the Philippines, and how do you balance the concerns of public health with the concerns of the economy. I think the question is really interesting because it recognizes that these are both priorities under the 1987 Constitution, but there's not a clear rule as to which one do you prioritize when the two are at odds. So how do we look to the Constitution to help us maybe to sort through some of those conflicts? And I think the last question, there was a question about why is it timely to discuss constitutional change in the time of the pandemic, which I think goes back to the question I asked earlier about, what does this say? Is constitutional change still required? So I think that would be a really good way to end. Why are we having this discussion right now? Why is it timely to talk about constitutional change at this time? And also, what it might mean for the future. of the Philippines. So I will hand it off and then we'll close after these questions. But we are keeping track of all the questions. We have them in written form. And so we will try our best to follow up for ones that we were unable to answer during the course of the Q&A.
Can I answer that question? If we follow the news, in many countries, I think the trend is that there appears to be a relationship between working good existing public healthcare systems and COVID response. So the dilemma with respect to the government having to decide between prioritizing health or prioritizing the economy is not solely a monopoly of the Philippine government. It's not only Duterte which is in a bind. I mean, yeah, it's like being caught between the devil and the deep blue sea, but this is really a policy question. However, my take is that governments have to work based on existing mechanisms in place. In our case, we don't even need charter change to effect changes. We just have to work and maximize the arsenal that we have. That's my take.
And Amanda? Yeah, maybe on the question of why are we talking about the Constitution at this time? Of course, it's important to focus on the 1987 Constitution, not only because maybe we want to change it, but actually the goal of the project precisely is to assess if the 1987 Constitution is working. Based on a number of criteria. And what we did is to see whether the problem is actually in a particular area is in the Constitution itself. So therefore, the response or the recommendation will be, should we change certain elements in the Constitution, or is the problem in terms of laws that have not yet been implemented, or are there laws that require amendments? So I think what we are doing at this point is to look at the issues that are important to us based on the goals of the Constitution and see if there are changes. And you will see that in our first publication in February. We divided the recommendations into possible provisions in the Constitution that require some fine-tuning or changes, but what are laws that are required to be passed by Congress, what are revisions needed, and issues related with implementation. Because the question is not always in terms of whether the Constitution is not achieving its goals, therefore we change it. The issue is finding out where the problems are, and sometimes the problems are not really in the Constitution itself, but in terms of the other implementing laws or absence of implementing laws, or the way we have organized certain offices or certain processes. And I think based on the need for changes, the changes, as Aris mentioned earlier, need not always be institutional, or it can be a combination, but it's important to also focus on incremental changes. And some of the incremental changes can actually happen at the local level. I read a particular comment on the need to continuously train, particularly barangay officials, and that's very important. But I think let's not just concentrate on actual or existing officials, those that are now occupying positions at the local level. We can focus on possibility of new leaders, and we have seen in the last elections new leaders, new faces that are cropping up. And regarding issues on changing, for instance, making elections more competitive, we have been discussing for the past few weeks the issue of oligarchs, and should we really have an anti-dynasty law at the local level? Look at the new SK law. We have already incorporated an anti-dynasty provision there. So incrementally, maybe the next step is to address certain provisions in the local government code that can address certain elements or that are related to limiting or controlling political dynasties at the local level. So these things can happen also incrementally, not necessarily at the Constitution level. Thank you.
just to supplement what Professor Atienza has already said, public opinion polls are clear. Only a minority of Filipinos know their constitution. And if you look at all the advanced democracies around the world, those that have consolidated their democracies, one common factor is that people own their constitution. People defend their constitution, and people are willing to make it better because it is not a perfect document. So I think continuously talking about the constitution, popularizing it, as well as making it something palatable as well as reachable for the ordinary Filipino is something that is a role that not only academics should play, not only lawyers should play, but also teachers as well as other sectors of society. So democratization cannot be suspended just because of the pandemic. In fact, if you have a government that is perceived to be eroding democracy, then talking about defending and enhancing the Constitution makes it more a critical topic to talk about.
Thank you so much. Would any of the other panelists like to give any concluding remarks? No?
Hi.
Dean, okay,
Amanda,
yes.
yeah, I just would like to say that, as we've seen in this pandemic, legislative executive relations and their genuine separation of powers is still very much a work in progress. So we should always monitor what Congress does and the way um, the executive encroaches on the powers of Congress, the accountability of Congress to its constituents, because that's, I mean, if the horizontal accountability mechanisms fail, then we move to societal accountability. Thank you.
Anybody else? Or shall we conclude our discussion for the day? I'm not seeing any takers unless I'm missing somebody. So I just want to thank all of our participants for joining us for such a long and fruitful discussion. I hope it was interesting for all of you. It was certainly really interesting for me to listen to all the researchers and panelists, and even though I've read the paper many times, to hear it from your perspective was very fascinating. So thank you also to the panelists for their time. In general, of course, so we want to thank International IDEA for supporting the event, along with UP, CIDS. Wouldn't have been able to put this together if it was just one of us. So I think it's really about the partnership. So thank you to everybody. I hope that we can end on a hopeful note. We were discussing before we started this call that COVID has presented a number of challenges for countries all over the world. I think there's very few countries that we can actually look to and say they have managed it very well. Most countries have been struggling. So I think this was a timely way to unpack, what is really challenging about the pandemic itself, but then also maybe what are the underlying issues that the pandemic is bringing out, and that was the intent of this discussion. But also to end on a hopeful note, which I think is that there are a lot of innovations happening, and the pandemic is forcing, they say necessity is the mother of creation, so it is forcing all of us to think of new ways of governing, new practices of ensuring accountability even at a distance. And in that way, I think that maybe we can be grateful for some of the insights that we're walking away from, even though this is a difficult time. So thank you very much to everybody joining from wherever you are. Thank you for all the questions, and we hope to see you again soon. Please do read the paper. We will circulate the link as well as the YouTube link for the recorded session today shortly. So thank you very much. I don't know, Ella, if you'd like to say anything to conclude as well.
TESA is no longer in attendance, maybe on behalf of UP-CIDS and the UP Department of Political Science. We are always grateful for the partnership with International IDEA, and we hope that our continuing work will really be very helpful, not only in actually helping decision makers and implementers respond to concerns based on the 1987 Constitution, but also to allow more people awareness of our Constitution and continue discussing conversations about what would be better outcomes and what would be possible solutions, and to actually include citizens in the discussions about any possible reform or change, whether in the Constitution, in the way we, in the laws that we're passing or amending, or even in the way that we conduct politics in this country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think with that, GESM and CIDS will conclude the webinar. Thank you very much, and we look forward to any feedback you may have. And as I said earlier, we'll try to answer any questions that we didn't get to in the actual webinar over email. Thank you so much for everybody's participation.